Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, and it's not coming from the opposition. For the first time, Republicans themselves are pushing back against Donald Trump, quietly moving to block the power he's trying to hold on to at any cost. Imagine this moment, late at night in Washington, phones lighting up across Capitol Hill, aides whispering, senators checking their screens twice to make sure what they're reading is real, because the president is furious, not at Democrats, not at the media, but at his own party. For the first time in a long time, the rebellion isn't coming from protesters outside the gates. It's coming from inside the walls. Right now, Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump. This isn't the usual MAGA infighting or anonymous leaks. This is something deeper because it cuts directly into the one thing Trump believes he cannot live without: unchecked power. The reason this revolt matters is that Republican lawmakers are beginning to openly move against the very authority Trump is desperate to cling to. And when the guardrails inside the system start to activate, presidents don't respond calmly. They escalate. They declare emergencies. At the heart of this revolt is a simple but terrifying reality. The president has been publicly entertaining the idea of using military force in ways that could drag America into conflict, not with some distant adversary, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in blunt terms, it landed like a shockwave. Because once you strip away the bluster and the branding, what you're left with is a scenario that sounds absurd until you remember we've stopped being allowed to dismiss these statements as jokes. Greenland is not a blank space on a real estate map. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's core principle is collective defense. Any military action against that territory isn't just symbolic. It's a legal and strategic nightmare that theoretically places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers now have to seriously explain this to the public is itself a sign of how unmoored the conversation has become. No one voted for a presidency that risks a shooting war with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. This is where Trump's worldview becomes critical to understanding the backlash. He doesn't process geopolitics as alliances or treaties or shared security obligations. He processes it like property, like leverage, like a deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. That mindset might work in a boardroom, but in global politics, it gets people killed. Republican senators know this. They understand that once a president frames military action as an option, the machinery starts moving whether Congress likes it or not, which is why the War Powers Act suddenly became the battlefield, not as an abstract constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. When that brake was pulled, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's ability to act unilaterally, Trump didn't respond with negotiation or persuasion. He responded with rage, profanity, and threats, because that's what happens when someone who believes power is personal realizes it's actually conditional. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins wasn't just about one vote. It was about the shock of discovering that loyalty has limits, that even in his own party, there are lines that can't be crossed without resistance. And for Trump, that resistance feels existential because his entire second-term strategy hinges on projecting strength, inevitability, and control. Nothing undermines that faster than members of your own party publicly telling you no, especially when the issue at stake is war, authority, and constitutional boundaries. Faced with pushback, Trump doesn't retreat. He reframes. He reaches for the language of emergency, declaring extraordinary measures as political weapons. The declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits perfectly into this pattern. allowing him to cast himself as the sole protector of national security while portraying dissenting lawmakers as obstacles. Emergencies change the rules. Emergencies centralize authority. And emergencies shift attention away from uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why long-promised transparency efforts have stalled, why document releases have been delayed, and why it took bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to move certain oversight actions forward. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse start talking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and unanswered timelines, it signals something important. Not a conclusion, not an accusation, but concern that process itself has broken down. And that concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford, because his political survival depends not just on winning arguments, but on exhausting the public, flooding the zone, and keeping every controversy competing for oxygen. These threads aren't separate stories. Republican revolt, war powers, emergency declarations, and stalled disclosures are the same story viewed from different angles. A presidency trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. Republicans who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party loyalty, and realizing that if they don't act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because once a president openly suggests he is guided only by his own judgment and not by law, treaties, or precedent, the question stops being partisan and becomes structural. And that's the moment we're in. A moment where behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is an act of betrayal or an act of preservation. History doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who stepped in when the rules were bending past their breaking point. As this internal rebellion deepens, the real story shifts from what Trump is saying publicly to what Republicans are doing privately. Behind the cameras, there is a growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency, but with a leader who sees every institutional limit as a personal insult. When the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican votes, it wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move by senators who understand that once the executive branch normalizes unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. The fact that Trump reacted with profanity, intimidation, and threats of political destruction only reinforces the concern that his decision-making process is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and legacy obsession. Legacy is a critical word here because Trump's fixation on being remembered as dominant and historically consequential has increasingly collided with the reality that his promises have not translated into stability or restraint. When the myth of no new wars collapses under the weight of military rhetoric, even loyal supporters begin to fracture. Wars are not abstractions to voters. They are costs, risks, and consequences. And Republicans up for re-election understand that no amount of branding can sell a conflict with allies as a victory. Trump's turn toward emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like panic. Emergencies allow him to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and recast opposition as sabotage. The Venezuelan oil emergency is a textbook example of how economic assets are framed as security imperatives, even when practical benefits are distant and uncertain. The language of emergency is about optics and control, not timelines or feasibility. While the administration insists this move is about protecting American interests, lawmakers see something else: a strategic distraction designed to shift attention from congressional oversight, internal party dissent, and scrutiny of executive follow-through. Trump's relationship with his own party has become increasingly adversarial because he doesn't just want support, he demands submission. When senators assert independence, he treats it as betrayal rather than governance, publicly threatening their careers while privately depending on their votes for judicial confirmations, legislative priorities, and institutional cover. That contradiction exposes the fragility of his position, because power that relies on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. We're watching that process unfold in real time as Republican senators quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide when and how to draw lines that were once unthinkable to draw. This internal calculation is fueled by a broader concern that Trump's rhetoric about law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic, but operational. When a president suggests he is governed by personal judgment rather than international law or constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview in which rules exist only when convenient. That worldview terrifies lawmakers who understand that precedent outlives presidencies. If these norms collapse now, they won't magically reappear later. This anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints, phone calls into confrontations, and policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. All of this is happening against a backdrop of mounting public confusion and fatigue, where voters struggle to separate spectacle from substance. And that confusion is not accidental. It's strategic, because a crowded information environment benefits those who thrive on chaos. Trump has always understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability, which is why the convergence of these stories matters so much. The war powers fight, the emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, and the stalled disclosures are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. Republicans who once rationalized every action as temporary or tactical are now confronting the possibility that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction itself becomes a form of consent. That realization has changed the tone inside the party, from loyalty to triage. They are no longer asking how to help Trump win the next news cycle. They are asking how to prevent irreversible damage to the institutions they still need to function after he is gone. That shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different. Quieter in some ways, but far more serious. Because it's driven not by ideology, but by alarm, by lawmakers who understand that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs. And once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without a cost. That cost is what Republicans are now trying, perhaps belatedly, to avoid. Even as Trump escalates attacks and frames every check on his power as an attack on the nation itself. Because in his mind, the two are inseparable. That belief, more than any single policy or controversy, is what has finally pushed members of his own party into open resistance, setting the stage for an internal confrontation that will define not just this presidency, but the future balance of power long after the headlines fade. And this is where the story ultimately lands. Not in a single vote, not in a single phone call, not even in a single emergency declaration, but in a reckoning that Republicans, Democrats, and the public alike can no longer postpone. What we are watching is not just a clash of personalities or a cycle of outrage. It's a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office rather than from outside threats. The reason this moment feels different, heavier, more consequential, is that the resistance is no longer purely partisan. It's institutional, it's procedural. It's driven by lawmakers who may disagree on ideology, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth: that power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and defended through intimidation, eventually turns against the very system that grants it legitimacy. Republicans know this, even if they won't all say it out loud, because they understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. And once those precedents exist, they don't belong to one man or one party anymore. They belong to whoever comes next. That realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Votes cast not for applause, but for restraint. Oversight requests framed not as attacks, but as necessities. And distance created not out of disloyalty, but out of self-preservation, because history is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality. Trump, for all his bravado, senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, and his reliance on emergency powers more pronounced. Leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down. They accelerate. They raise the stakes. They demand loyalty tests. And they insist that only they can protect the nation from collapse, even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. That paradox is at the center of this presidency's final act. A leader obsessed with legacy, but increasingly boxed in by process. A party torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival. And institutions forced to choose whether they will be performative or functional when it matters most. The real question isn't whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who temporarily hold it. That question doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters, to citizens, to anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. As this revolt continues, as oversight grinds forward, and as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands, not in theory, but in practice. Systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested, and normalized, until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming not from the outside, but from within, from Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far is not betrayal, it's responsibility. Whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency, but the rules every future president inherits. which is why this moment matters so much. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky. That defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines. One that will be written not by declarations or threats, but by the choices made when power meets its limits.